I'm going to read the China study to you. There's the cover. Doing this because while vegans might tell people, paleo people, to read this book, the reality is that they're probably not going to, whilst they might watch a video. So, here goes. Engage with individual arguments in the book, as opposed to just throwing the book at someone and telling him to get on with it. This part I'm reading is called Fat and a Focus on Cancer. The 1982 National Academy of Sciences, NAS, report on diet, nutrition and cancer, of which I was a co-author, was the first expert panel report that deliberated on the association of dietary fat with cancer. This report was the first to recommend a maximum fat intake of 30% of calories for cancer prevention. Previously, the US Senate Select Committee on Nutrition, chaired by Senator George McGovern, 26, that's a reference, I'll put that in the description, held widely publicized hearings on diet and heart disease and recommended a maximum intake of 30% dietary fat. Although the McGovern report generated a public discourse on diet and disease, it was the 1982 NAS report that gave momentum to this debate. Its focus on cancer as opposed to heart disease increased public interest and concern. It spurred additional research activity and public awareness of the importance of diet in disease prevention. Many of the reports at the time, 20, 27, 28, were centered on the question of how much dietary fat was appropriate for good health. The unique attention given to fat was motivated by international studies showing that the amount of dietary fat consumed was closely associated with the incidence of breast cancer, large bowel cancer, and heart disease. These were the diseases that killed the majority of people in Western countries before their time. Clearly, this correlation was destined to attract great public attention. The China study was begun in the midst of this environment. The best-known study, 29, in my view, was that of the late Ken Carroll, professor at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. His findings showed a very impressive relationship between dietary fat and breast cancer. Chart 4.7. Yeah. Pause that and have a look. This finding, which corresponded to the earlier reports of others, 30, became especially intriguing when compared with migrant studies, 31-32. These studies showed that people who migrated from one area to another and who started eating the typical diet of their new residency assumed a disease risk of the area to which they moved. This strongly implied that diet and lifestyle were the principal causes of these diseases, but also suggested that genes are not necessarily that important. As noted earlier, a very prominent report by Richard Doll and Richard Peter of the University of Oxford, submitted to the US Congress, summarized many of these studies and concluded that only 2 to 3% of all cancers could be attributed to genes. 4. Do the data from these international and migrant studies mean that we can lower our rate of breast cancer to almost zero if we make perfect lifestyle choices? The information certainly suggests that this could be the case. Concerning the evidence in chart 4.7, the solution seems obvious. If we eat less fat, then we'll lower our breast cancer risk. Most scientists made this conclusion, and some surmised that dietary fat caused breast cancer, but that interpretation was much too simple. Other charts prepared by Professor Carroll were largely, almost totally ignored. They show that breast cancer was associated with animal fat intake, but not with plant fat. In rural China, dietary fat intake at the time of the survey in 1983 was very different from the United States in two ways. First, fat was only 14.5% of calorie intake in China, compared with about 36% in the US. Second, the amount of fat in the diets of rural China depended almost entirely on the amount of animal-based food in the diet. Just like the findings in chart 4.7. The correlation between dietary fat and animal protein in rural China was very high, at 70 to 84%, similar to the 93% seen when comparing different countries. This is important because in China and the international studies, fat consumption was only an indication of animal-based food consumption. Thus, the association between fat and breast cancer might be might really be telling us that as consumption of animal-based foods go up, so does breast cancer. This is not the case in the US, where we selectively add or remove fat from our foods and our diets. We get as much or more fat from plant-based food, potato chips, french fries, as we get from processed animal-based foods, skim milk, lean cuts of meat. China does not tinker with fat in their food supply as we do here. At this very low range of dietary fat in China, from 6% to 24%, I initially thought that dietary fat would not be linked with diseases like heart disease or the various cancers, as it is in the West. Some people in the US, like many of my colleagues in science and medicine, call a 30% diet a low-fat diet. Therefore, a low-fat diet containing only 25 to 30% fat was thought to be low enough to obtain the maximum amount of health benefits. This implied that going lower provided no further benefit. Surprise! Findings from rural China showed that reducing dietary fat from 24% to 6% was associated with lower breast cancer risk. However, lower dietary fat in rural China meant less consumption, not only of fat, but more importantly of animal-based food. This connection of breast cancer with dietary fat, thus with animal-based foods, brought into consideration other factors that also place a woman at risk for breast cancer: early age of menarche, age of first menstruation, high blood cholesterol, late menopause, high exposure to female hormones. What does the China study show regarding these risk factors? Higher dietary fat is associated with higher blood cholesterol, and both of these factors, along with higher female hormone levels, are associated in turn with more breast cancer and earlier age of menarche. The much later age of menarche in rural China is remarkable. 25 women in each of the 130 villages in the survey were asked when they had their first menstrual period. The range of village averages was 15 to 19 years, with an average of 17 years. The US average is roughly 11 years. Many studies have shown that earlier menarche leads to higher risk for breast cancer, 34. Menarche is triggered by the growth rate of the girl. The faster the growth, the earlier the age of onset. It also is well established that rapid growth of young girls often leads to greater adult body height and more body weight and body fatness, each of which is associated with higher breast cancer risk. Early age of menarche, both in Chinese and in Western women, also leads to higher levels of blood hormones such as estrogen. These hormone levels remain high throughout the reproductive years if consumption of a diet rich in animal-based foods is maintained. Under these conditions, age of menopause is deferred by 3 to 4 years, thus extending the reproductive life from beginning to end by about 9 to 10 years and greatly increasing lifetime overall exposure to female hormones. Other studies have shown that an increase in years of reproductive life is associated with increased breast cancer risk, 35-36. This network of relationships becomes still more impressive. High fat consumption is associated with higher blood levels of estrogen during the critical years of 35 to 44 years, and higher blood levels of the female hormone prolactin during the later years of 55 to 64 years. These hormones are highly correlated with animal protein intake and milk and meat. Unfortunately, we could not demonstrate whether these hormone levels were directly related to breast cancer risk in China because the rate of disease is so low. Nonetheless, when hormone levels among Chinese women were compared with those of British women, Chinese estrogen levels were only about half those of the British women, who have an equivalent hormone profile to that of American women. Because the length of the reproductive life of a Chinese woman is only about 75% of that of the British or American woman, this means that with lower estrogen levels, the Chinese woman only experiences about 35 to 40% of the lifetime estrogen exposure of British and American women. This corresponds to Chinese breast cancer rates that are only 1/5 of those of Western women. The strong association of a high animal protein, high fat diet, which go hand in hand by the way, with reproductive hormones and early age of menarche, both of which raise the risk of breast cancer, is an important observation. It makes clear that we should not have our children consume diets high in animal-based foods. If you are a woman, would you ever have imagined that eating diets higher in animal-based foods would expand your reproductive life by about 9 to 10 years? As an aside, an interesting implication of this observation is noted by Miss Magazine founder Gloria Steinem, is that eating the right foods could reduce teenage pregnancy by delaying the age of menarche. Beyond the hormone findings, is there a way to show that animal-based food intake relates to overall cancer rates? This is somewhat difficult, but one of the factors we measured was how much cancer there was in each family. Animal protein intake was convincingly associated in the China study with the prevalence of cancer in families. This association is an impressive and significant observation, considering the unusually low intake of animal protein. Diet and disease factors such as animal protein consumption or breast cancer incidence lead to changes in the concentrations of certain chemicals in our blood. These chemicals are called biomarkers. As an example, blood cholesterol is a biomarker for heart disease. We measured 6 blood biomarkers that are associated with animal protein intake. 39. Do they confirm the finding that animal protein intake is associated with cancer in families? Absolutely. Every single animal protein related blood biomarker is significantly associated with the amount of cancer in a family. In this case, multiple observations tightly networked into a web show that animal-based foods are strongly linked to breast cancer. What makes this conclusion especially compelling are 2 kinds of evidence. First, the individual parts of this web were consistently correlated and in most cases were statistically significant. Second, this effect occurred at unusually low intakes of animal-based foods. Our investigation of breast cancer is a perfect example of what makes the China study so convincing. Rather than a single, simple association of fat and breast cancer, we were able to construct a much more expansive web of information about how diet affects breast cancer risk. We were able to examine in multiple ways the role of diet and cholesterol, age of menarche and female hormone levels, all of which are known risk factors for breast cancer. When each new finding pointed in the same direction, we were able to see a picture that was convincing, consistent, and biologically plausible.